Hey, fourth grade. Today we're going to be talking about early settlements in Kentucky. Our last lesson, we talked about some early explorers into Kentucky. We talked about Daniel Boone and Thomas Walker. And now we're going to learn about the first groups of people that come into Kentucky to try to live permanently and a little bit about what happens to them. So in 1774, Harrodsburg gets established as the first permanent settlement in Kentucky. And James Harrod was the man that got this settlement started. He came to Kentucky with 31 settlers and they paddled down the Ohio River until they came to the Kentucky River. And then they headed basically south down the Kentucky River. And they went into what is now Mercer County and they decided that they would set up a settlement there. And they knew they needed to be near fresh water, so they built their settlement close to the Kentucky River. And their settlement was also built close to a spring, a natural spring where they could get fresh water. The spring actually was built. Well, they've actually built their settlement around part of that spring. So the spring was inside the walls of their fort. Part of it was. So they built a fort like this picture. It had walls to protect the settlers from Native American attacks. The Native Americans didn't want the settlers to live where they hunted. And so the Native Americans were attacking often. And the reason that the Native Americans didn't want the settlers there, well, there were really two reasons. But the first reason was when the settlers were hunting and taking a lot of the deer and animals that they were going to hunt for their own tribes and taking their food source away. And then another part of the hunting that upset the Native Americans was that the settlers would eat the meat and they would use the deer hide for clothing or shelter. And the Indians, when they killed a deer, they would use all parts of the deer. They would use the meat, the hide, the bones. They would make tools out of the bones. They would eat the meat. They would make the hide. They would use all the parts of the deer. And then the Native Americans believed that if they were going to actually take the life of this deer, that they needed to justify it by using all the parts of the deer. And that's exactly what they did. So you take a closer look at this actual fort, you can see that it's got walls all the way around, but when you look closer, you see each of the walls are partially made up of the cabins of the settlers. And at each of the four corners of the fort, they've got basically what's like a guard tower. They've got a front gate, a back gate. There's a blacksmith inside. There's a place to grow crops inside. On these towers, there were holes in the wall where they could stick their muskets through to fire at Native Americans when they were attacking. This is a replica of the fort. You can go visit that. It's a state park in Kentucky. I highly recommend it if you get a chance. I've been there 3 or 4 times. I took 2 classes on field trips there. I took my son there on his 6th birthday. Excuse me. It's a neat place to visit. It's a 1-to-1 scale, exact scale replica of the fort. Here's one of the guard towers. You can see some of the houses right here that make up the wall. This is inside the fort looking at one of the guard towers. See, they've got a chimney hooked up to their fireplace where the the smoke's going to rise and come out the top and not be inside the building. And they could use that for heat and for cooking purposes. This is a replica of the first school that was in Kentucky, and it's inside Fort Harrod. It's a little one-room schoolhouse. Inside of it, it's close to the size of our classroom at Providence on the inside. Very barren on the inside. There's some benches. There's rows of benches. There's one chalkboard, and that's about it. The thing that baffled me or surprised me about the school was most log cabins, when they're built, they fill in the gaps in between the logs, and this one doesn't have any of those gaps filled in, so sunlight and wind would come through. Um, Hopefully, they would fill those in with mud or something during the wintertime so they wouldn't get too cold. So the first settlement in Kentucky, reviewing a little bit, was called Fort Harrod or Harrod. It's Harrodsburg today. It was Fort Harrod when it was first built. The Native Americans attacked a lot and eventually drove those settlers to leave because of the constant attacks. So James Harrod leaves with the remaining settlers that were still alive after the attacks. He comes back a year later with many more settlers, resettles in the fort, rebuilds the damage, and has enough men to defend the fort with him. So it becomes a permanent settlement in Kentucky. Another permanent settlement was also started in 1775. This settlement was funded by a company called the Transylvania Land Company. And this company wanted to increase its land holdings. They were hoping that the settlers would be able to get animal fur, like beaver skin, deer skin, and they were hoping the settlers would plant large farms, and that company was going to make money off of that. The company hired Daniel Boone to start the settlement. So Daniel Boone and 30 men, they were all men, headed into Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap with their horses and wagons full of supplies. Remember, the Cumberland Gap was, we talked about that in a previous lesson. So it's a space in between the mountains, in between the Appalachian Mountains, and but the road was really a path that animals took. It was really a buffalo trace, and that was a path buffalo would go through, and other animals, but their wagons wouldn't quite fit. And so as they were going down through the road, they had to cut trees down and thick bushes and shrubs, so it was very slow going. They eventually get to the Kentucky River. It's not super far from Fort Herod, and they build a similar fort, looks almost exactly the same, and it's called Boonesboro, and that becomes the second permanent settlement in Kentucky. Let's take a quick look at our questions. First question: why was it important for the settlements to be fortified by building walls around the houses, making a fort? That's a one or two sentence answer. Number two: why might both settlements be built near a river? That's a two-sentence answer. And number three: explain why the Native Americans did not like the settlers moving into Kentucky. That's a two-sentence answer. Read back through the text. Everything I just went over is in your Google Drive. Read back through the text. Take your time, find the information, and you will do awesome. And I will see you next week, and we are going to review the 13 original colonies. See you then.